Sarah Mills hadn't visited her grandmother's house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in over 15 years. Standing before the Victorian-era home with its weathered shingles and sagging porch, memories of childhood summers spent exploring its dusty rooms came flooding back. Her grandmother Elizabeth had passed away last month at 93, and as the only surviving relative, Sarah was tasked with settling the estate. "It's exactly how I remember it," she murmured to her husband Mark, who was busy retrieving luggage from their rental car. A brisk October wind rustled the ancient maple trees flanking the property, sending crimson leaves skittering across the overgrown lawn. "Creepier than I pictured," Mark admitted, surveying the three-story structure with its peeling paint and darkened windows. "Your grandmother lived here alone all these years?" Sarah nodded, fishing the old brass key from her pocket. "After Grandpa died in 85, she refused to leave, said this place was in her blood." The front door groaned in protest as Sarah pushed it open, revealing a foyer frozen in time. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mothballs and old books. Antique furniture draped in white sheets loomed like ghosts in the dim light filtering through lace curtains. "We should open some windows," Mark suggested, setting down their bags. "Get some fresh air in here." Sarah moved through the house with cautious familiarity, memories sharpening with each room she entered. The parlor with its faded wallpaper, the kitchen with its ancient appliances, the narrow staircase leading to the bedrooms upstairs, all exactly as she remembered, yet somehow smaller. In the study, Sarah found her grandmother's desk covered in papers, bills, correspondence, and legal documents arranged in neat piles. She would need to sort through it all eventually, but something else caught her attention. A leather-bound photo album she didn't recognize, placed carefully in the center of the desk. Curious, she opened it to find family photographs dating back to the late 1800s. Her fingers traced the faded images of stern-faced ancestors in formal attire, names and dates meticulously noted beneath each picture. Near the middle of the album, Sarah paused at a photograph from 1901. It showed her great-grandparents standing outside this very house with their 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. But what made her breath catch was a 5th child in the photograph, a girl of about 7 standing slightly apart from the others, her face solemn, her eyes seeming to stare directly into the camera. Unlike the others in their Sunday best, she wore a simple white dress. The caption below read, "The Mills Family, Summer 1901. "Mark, come look at this," Sarah called, a strange uneasiness settling in her stomach. When Mark joined her, she pointed to the photograph. "Do you see that girl on the end? I've never heard of her before. According to family history, my great-grandparents only had 4 children." Mark studied the photograph. "Maybe a cousin who was visiting? Or a neighbor's kid? Then why is she in the formal family portrait?" Sarah flipped through the album, searching for other photographs of the mysterious girl, but found none. "It's strange. She's only in this one picture." As they continued examining the album, neither noticed the subtle drop in temperature in the room, nor the way the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen despite the afternoon light streaming through the windows. That night, after a simple dinner of takeout from the town's only diner, Sarah found herself drawn back to the photograph. Something about the unknown girl's expression, a mixture of sadness and intensity, unsettled her. With her smartphone, she took a picture of the old photograph, intending to ask her mother's elderly cousin Harriet if she knew anything about the family's history. Later, as Sarah and Mark settled into her grandmother's old bedroom for the night, the house creaked and groaned around them like a living thing. Sarah drifted off to sleep with the mysterious girl's face floating in her mind, wondering why no one had ever mentioned her existence and why her name was absent from the careful documentation that accompanied every other family photograph. Sarah awoke to the sound of a child's laughter. Disoriented, she sat up in bed, the unfamiliar shadows of her grandmother's room taking shape in the pre-dawn gloom. Beside her, Mark slept soundly, untroubled by the noise that had jerked her from sleep. "Hello," she called softly, then felt foolish. They were alone in the house. It must have been a dream, or perhaps a sound from outside. Unable to fall back asleep, Sarah wrapped herself in her grandmother's old cardigan and padded downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was still dark, the ancient refrigerator humming loudly in the silence. As she filled the coffee maker with water, she noticed something on the counter that hadn't been there the night before. The photo album, open to the 1901 family portrait. A chill ran through her. She was certain they had left it in the study. Mark must have looked at it again before bed, she reasoned aloud, her voice sounding thin in the empty kitchen. After brewing coffee, Sarah took her mug to the study and began the task of sorting through her grandmother's papers. She found property deeds, insurance policies, and decades of correspondence neatly organized in folders. Her grandmother had been meticulous about preserving family records. In a drawer of the desk, Sarah discovered a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, dated from 1901 to 1905. They were written by her great-grandmother, Margaret Mills, to her sister in Boston. With careful fingers, Sarah unfolded the brittle paper of the earliest letter. "Dearest Louisa," it began, "I write with a heavy heart. Little Alice has not improved since my last letter. The doctor fears the consumption has spread. William insists we remain hopeful, but I see the truth in his eyes when he thinks I'm not looking." Sarah frowned. Alice. She had never heard of an Alice in the family. She quickly scanned through the other letters, finding frequent mentions of this child's declining health. In a letter dated November 1901, she found her answer. "Our darling Alice passed peacefully yesterday evening. William is inconsolable, having been so certain that the new treatment would save her. The children are bewildered, especially young Thomas, who keeps asking when his sister will return from heaven." "My God," Sarah whispered, connecting the dots. The girl in the photograph must be Alice, a child who died of tuberculosis shortly after the family portrait was taken. But why had Alice been erased from family history? Why had no one ever mentioned her? A soft thump from upstairs interrupted her thoughts. Mark must be awake. Sarah gathered the letters, intending to show him her discovery, when she noticed the temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. Her breath fogged in the air. "Mark!" she called, rising from the desk. No answer came, but the distinct sound of small footsteps crossed the ceiling above her, light and quick, like a child running. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly climbed the stairs. "Mark, are you up?" She found him still asleep in bed, exactly where she'd left him. The footsteps she'd heard couldn't have been his. Standing in the upstairs hallway, Sarah felt a distinct sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, half expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. 4 doors led off the corridor. The master bedroom where Mark slept, 2 spare rooms, and at the end, a small room her grandmother had always kept locked, claiming it was merely storage. The door to that room now stood slightly ajar. Sarah approached cautiously, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open wider. Unlike the rest of the house, this room appeared untouched by time. Faded pink wallpaper adorned with tiny roses covered the walls, and a small iron bed with a patchwork quilt sat in the corner. A child's vanity table stood beneath the window, and shelves held antique dolls and children's books from the turn of the century. It was a little girl's bedroom, preserved for over 100 years. On the vanity table sat a silver-handled hairbrush, a few strands of dark hair still caught in its bristles, and a framed photograph of the same solemn-faced girl from the family portrait. Beneath the frame, written in faded ink on a yellowed card, was a single word: Alice. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her grandmother had maintained this shrine in secret all these years. But why had the family erased Alice from their history? And why did Sarah feel, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't alone in the room? "This doesn't make any sense," Mark said, examining the preserved bedroom later that morning. "Your grandmother never mentioned this room to you, never talked about a great-aunt named Alice." Sarah shook her head, clutching the bundle of letters. I called Mum's cousin Harriet this morning. She's in her 80s now and has all the family stories, but even she claimed she's never heard of an Alice Mills. She said as far as she knew, my great-grandparents only had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl named Ruth, who was my grandmother's mother. Mark ran his fingers along the vanity table, which was coated with a thin layer of dust. Someone's been maintaining this room, though. These things would be in much worse condition after 120 years. Boo, it had to be Grandma Elizabeth, Sarah said. But why? And why would our family erase Alice from our history? She was just a child who died of tuberculosis. Mark picked up a small leather-bound book from the bedside table. Maybe this will tell us something. Looks like a diary. The journal belonged to Ruth Mills, Alice's sister, who would later become Sarah's great-grandmother. The entries began in 1899, when Ruth was 12 years old, and continued until 1905. Sarah sat on the edge of the small bed and began reading aloud. April 18th, 1900. Alice has been sick again. Mother called the doctor, who prescribed a new tonic, but it doesn't seem to help. Father spent the entire morning in his study, writing letters to specialists in Boston. I heard Mother crying when she thought no one was listening. Sarah flipped through more pages, finding frequent mentions of Alice's illness and the family's increasing desperation to find a cure. Then she came to an entry from September 1901, a month before Alice's death. September 15th, 1901. Father returned from Boston today with a woman he says is a specialist. She doesn't look like any doctor I've ever seen. She wears strange charms and speaks with an accent I cannot place. Mother doesn't like her, I can tell, but Father insists she has cured cases the medical doctors deemed hopeless. The woman spent hours alone with Alice, burning herbs and chanting words in a language I don't understand. After she left, Alice seemed stronger than she has in months. Father calls it a miracle. Mother calls it blasphemy. The entries that followed documented Alice's apparent recovery, her color returning, her appetite improving, her energy rebounding. But the tone of Ruth's writing grew increasingly uneasy. October 2nd, 1901. Something is wrong with Alice. She's no longer bedridden, but she is not herself either. She stands for hours at her bedroom window, staring at nothing. When I speak to her, she sometimes doesn't respond, as if she cannot hear me. Other times, she says things that make no sense, about shadows and whispers, and someone waiting in the walls. Mother has forbidden us from entering Alice's room alone. Sarah's voice faltered as she read the entry from October 20th, 1901. Alice died last night, but not from the consumption. I'm not supposed to know what happened, but I crept downstairs when I heard the shouting. Father was holding Alice's body, soaking wet from the bathtub, screaming that he was only trying to cleanse her. Mother was hysterical, saying over and over, "That wasn't Alice anymore. That wasn't our daughter." The specialist woman was there too, saying something went wrong with the ritual, that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. They argued about what to tell people. Finally, they agreed to say Alice succumbed to her illness. The woman helped them do something in the cellar afterward. I was too afraid to follow. Sarah closed the diary, her hands shaking. They did something to her, some kind of ritual that went wrong. And then they covered it up, Mark added, his face pale. They literally erased her from family history. A loud crash from downstairs made them both jump. They hurried down to find the photo album had fallen from the study desk, its pages open to the 1901 family portrait. Except now, the image had changed. Alice's face was blurred, as if someone had taken a wet cloth and smeared the photographic emulsion. "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, picking up the album with trembling hands. It wasn't like this before. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The revelation of what had happened to Alice, some kind of failed supernatural intervention, followed by her death and the family's cover-up, left her mind racing. Around 2 a.m. she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and made her way to the cellar door off the kitchen. She had avoided the cellar yesterday, put off by its musty smell and inadequate lighting. Now, steeling herself with a flashlight, she descended the creaking wooden steps into the darkness below. The cellar was mostly as expected: stone foundation walls, dirt floor in some areas, rough concrete in others. Old trunks and furniture gathered dust in the corners. A rusted furnace squatted in the center like an industrial monster. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the walls, stopping at an anomaly in the stonework on the far side. A section of the wall appeared newer than the rest, the mortar a slightly different color. Heart-pounding, she approached it, running her hands over the stones. One of them wobbled under her touch. With trembling fingers, she worked the loose stone free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a small object wrapped in deteriorating cloth. Sarah carefully extracted it. A child's doll, crudely made of twisted cloth with button eyes and stitched mouth. Pinned to it was a yellowed piece of paper with spidery handwriting, "To bind what was wrongfully called." As Sarah held the doll in her palm, a wave of cold air swept through the cellar, extinguishing her flashlight. In the sudden darkness, she heard it clearly. The sound of a child sobbing somewhere very close by. "Alice," Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft patter of footsteps on the dirt floor, circling her in the darkness. "I don't care what it takes, we're getting rid of that doll," Mark insisted the next morning, staring at the cloth figure Sarah had placed on the kitchen table. Neither of them had slept well after Sarah's discovery in the cellar. Strange noises had plagued the house throughout the night, creaking floorboards, slamming doors, and at one point the distinct sound of a child's voice singing a half-remembered lullaby. "We can't just throw it away," Sarah argued. "It's connected to whatever happened to Alice. I think it was used in whatever ritual they performed, some kind of binding spell to contain whatever they believed had possessed her." Mark ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Listen to yourself, Sarah. Possession, binding spells, this isn't like you." "None of this is like me," she admitted, "but I can't ignore what's happening." First the photo album moving on its own, then Alice's face blurring in the photograph, and now this doll hidden in the wall. Something happened in this house, something the family tried to cover up, and I think... She was interrupted by the ringing of her cell phone. It was Harriet, her mother's elderly cousin. "Sarah, dear," Harriet's voice quavered on the line. "I've been thinking about what you asked me yesterday, about a girl named Alice. I spoke with my sister Virginia last night, and she remembered something our mother once told us when she'd had too much sherry at Christmas. It was about a family scandal, something hushed up." Sarah put the phone on speaker so Mark could hear. "What did she say, Harriet?" "Mother said there was a sister who died, one the family didn't speak of, not because she died young, which wasn't uncommon back then, but because of how she died. There were rumors in town that the Mills family had consulted a woman known for unconventional remedies. Some called her a witch doctor, though I suspect she was more likely an immigrant with traditional healing knowledge that seemed exotic to New Englanders." "What happened to Alice?" Sarah pressed. There was a long pause on the line. "Mother said the child drowned in the bathtub. The official story was consumption, but servants talked. There was some suggestion that the father, in his desperation to save his daughter, had done something unnatural, invited something into their home that didn't belong. After the girl died, the family never spoke her name again. They even removed her from photographs. But I found a photograph with her in it," Sarah said, "from 1901. That's unusual. Mother specifically mentioned that they destroyed all images of her. Said it was part of whatever ritual the woman instructed them to perform afterward, to seal away what they'd unleashed." After ending the call, Sarah and Mark sat in stunned silence. The cloth doll seemed to watch them with its button eyes. "We need to find out more about this specialist they brought in," Mark finally said. "If this was some kind of ritual gone wrong, there might be records of similar cases." Sarah spent the afternoon researching at the Portsmouth Historical Society. while Mark continued organizing the house. The Society's archives yielded several interesting discoveries. Newspaper articles from 1901 mentioned a foreign woman who had taken up residence on the outskirts of town, offering treatments for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't cure. Local ministers had warned their congregations against seeking her help, calling her practices ungodly. More disturbing was an article from November 1901, just after Alice's death, reporting that the woman's cottage had been burned to the ground by persons unknown. The woman herself had disappeared. When Sarah returned to the house late that afternoon, she found Mark in the study, surrounded by papers. "I found something," he said without preamble, "in a hidden compartment in your grandmother's desk. It's a letter from your great-grandfather William to your grandmother Elizabeth, written in 1950, when Elizabeth was a young woman." Sarah took the yellowed paper with trembling hands and read, "My dearest granddaughter, as I approach the end of my life, I must unburden myself of the terrible secret I have carried for nearly 50 years. Your mother Ruth has refused to accept this responsibility, so it falls to you. In 1901, my youngest daughter Alice was dying of consumption. In my arrogance and desperation, I sought help from a woman who claimed to have powers beyond medicine. The ritual she performed was meant to drive the disease from Alice's body, but something went terribly wrong. The child who returned to us was not my daughter, though she wore Alice's face. Whatever inhabited her was ancient and malevolent. When we realized what had happened, we sought the woman's help again. She told us the entity could be bound, but never destroyed. We performed the ritual as instructed, binding it to a vessel, which we sealed within the walls of our home. Your grandmother Margaret and I took additional precautions, removing Alice from family records, destroying photographs, never speaking her name. The binding has held for decades, but nothing lasts forever. If signs appear, cold spots in the house, objects moving, glimpses of a child who isn't there, the binding is weakening. You must renew it. Instructions are included with this letter. This burden is our family's to bear for my sin of tampering with forces I did not understand. May God forgive me. Your grandfather, William Mills." Sarah's hands shook as she set down the letter. There were no instructions with it, just the letter. "Maybe your grandmother destroyed them," Mark suggested, "or maybe she hid them somewhere else in the house." A child's laughter echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of running footsteps. "We need to leave," Mark said, standing abruptly. "Whatever's happening here is accelerating. We'll come back tomorrow with help, a medium, a priest, someone who knows about these things." But as they moved toward the foyer, a powerful gust of wind slammed through the house, rattling windows and sending papers flying. The front door banged shut on its own, and when Mark tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "It won't open," he shouted, throwing his shoulder against the solid oak. The temperature in the house plummeted suddenly, their breath visible in the air. The cloth doll, which Sarah had left on the kitchen table, now sat at the bottom of the stairs, its button eyes seeming to stare up at them. "She doesn't want us to leave," Sarah whispered. Night fell early, casting the old house into shadow. With the front door mysteriously jammed and the windows refusing to open, Sarah and Mark found themselves trapped inside. They had retreated to the master bedroom, the only room that seemed to maintain a normal temperature as the rest of the house grew increasingly cold. "There has to be something we're missing," Sarah said, pacing the room. "Great-grandfather William said Grandma Elizabeth knew how to renew the binding. She must have done it at least once in her lifetime." Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his phone's flashlight app illuminating the space. The power had gone out an hour ago, plunging the house into darkness except for their battery-powered devices. The doll is clearly part of it. It was hidden in the wall for a reason. "But we don't know the ritual," Sarah countered. "We don't know what words to say or what to do with it." A soft tapping sound drew their attention to the closed bedroom door, gentle, rhythmic, like a child's fingers playing against the wood. They froze, listening as it continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. "Alice," Sarah called out, ignoring Mark's warning look. "We know what happened to you. We know what they did." Silence answered her, a heavy, listening silence. "I don't think it's Alice," Mark whispered. "Not anymore. Your great-grandfather's letter was clear. Whatever came back wasn't his daughter." The tapping resumed, more insistent this time, followed by the sound of a child's voice, muffled through the door. "Let me in. I'm cold out here." Mark gripped Sarah's arm as she instinctively moved toward the door. "Don't." The voice came again, eerily perfect in its imitation of a child's innocent plea. "Please let me in. I'm scared of the dark." Sarah shook her head. "We need to find those instructions. If Grandma Elizabeth renewed the binding, she must have kept the ritual somewhere. Think, Sarah. If you were hiding instructions for a ritual no one was supposed to know about, where would you put them?" Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Not in plain sight. Not with other papers where they might be discovered accidentally. The hiding place would be significant, she realized aloud. Connected to Alice in some way. Mark nodded slowly. Her bedroom. The shrine your grandmother maintained. They hesitated, knowing they would have to open the door to reach Alice's preserved bedroom down the hall. The tapping had stopped, but the sense of something waiting just outside was palpable. "We go together," Mark said firmly. "Quickly, straight to Alice's room. Don't stop, don't look around." Sarah nodded, gripping his hand tightly as he yanked the door open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, their flashlight beams creating narrow corridors of visibility in the darkness. They moved quickly toward Alice's room, the floorboards creaking beneath their hurried steps. They were halfway there when Sarah's flashlight illuminated a small figure standing at the end of the hallway. A girl in a white dress, her face obscured by shadow, long dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. "Keep moving," Mark urged, pulling Sarah forward as she faltered. The child figure didn't move as they approached, but just as they reached Alice's room, Sarah could have sworn she saw the girl's face contort into something inhuman, the mouth stretching too wide, the eyes sunken and wrong. Once inside Alice's bedroom, Mark slammed the door shut behind them, leaning against it as if expecting something to try to force its way in. The preserved room felt strangely peaceful compared to the rest of the house, the antique dolls and children's books undisturbed in their century-long vigil. "Where would she hide them?" Mark asked, sweeping his flashlight across the room. Sarah approached the small vanity table where Alice's hairbrush and photograph sat. It would be somewhere personal, somewhere connected to Alice herself. Her fingers traced the edges of the vanity mirror, feeling for any hidden compartments. Finding nothing, she moved to the iron bed with its faded quilt, running her hands beneath the pillow, then lifting the thin mattress to check underneath. Nothing. She examined the antique dolls on the shelves, the spines of the children's books, growing increasingly desperate. "Maybe we're wrong," Mark said. "Maybe the instructions aren't here." But something caught Sarah's eye, the photograph of Alice in its silver frame. Unlike the family portrait downstairs, where Alice's face had blurred, this image remained clear and undisturbed. Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The backing of the frame was newer than it should have been. With trembling fingers, she pried open the back of the frame. Behind Alice's photograph was a folded piece of paper, the handwriting matching Elizabeth's distinctive script from the documents Sarah had sorted earlier. "I found it," she breathed, unfolding the paper. The instructions were concise, almost clinical. To renew the binding when signs appear. 1. Take the vessel from its hiding place. 2. Place it in the center of her room. 3. Encircle it with salt. 4. Recite the binding words 3 times. What was called remains bound. What was invited is refused. By blood and salt we renew the seal. 5. Prick your finger. Family blood is required. 6. Allow 3 drops to fall upon the vessel. 7. Return the vessel to the wall before dawn. This must be performed on the anniversary of her passing, October 20th. The binding will hold for another generation. Sarah looked at Mark, realization dawning. Today is October 20th. A violent thump against the bedroom door made them both jump, then another and another, like someone throwing their body against the wood. "We need salt," Mark said urgently. "There should be some in the kitchen." The pounding on the door intensified, the wood beginning to splinter at the hinges. Whatever was outside wanted in, and the door wouldn't hold much longer. "I'll go," Sarah decided. "You stay here with the doll and the instructions. I'll be faster on my own." Before Mark could protest, Sarah yanked the door open and darted into the hallway. It was empty now, the small figure nowhere to be seen. She ran for the stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. The kitchen was on the ground floor, at the back of the house. Sarah raced down the stairs, nearly losing her footing in her haste. The temperature dropped with each step she descended, until she could see her breath clouding in front of her when she reached the bottom. The darkness of the ground floor seemed thicker somehow, more absolute. Her flashlight barely penetrated it, the beam weakening, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the light. Sarah pressed forward, feeling her way along the wall toward the kitchen. She had almost reached it when her flashlight caught a glimpse of movement ahead, something small darting across her path. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "I know what you are," she said into the darkness, her voice steadier than she felt. "And you don't belong here." A child's giggle echoed from the shadows, followed by a sing-song voice. "Neither do you." Sarah steeled herself and pushed forward into the kitchen. She located the cabinet where they'd found salt earlier for cooking, grabbing the container with shaking hands. As she turned to leave, her flashlight illuminated a small figure sitting at the kitchen table, the girl from the photograph, Alice, or whatever wore her form. Up close, the wrongness was obvious. Though the shape was that of a 7-year-old girl, the eyes were ancient, filled with a malevolence no child could possess. The mouth stretched into a smile too wide for a human face. "They tried to save her," the thing that wasn't Alice said, its voice alternating between a child's high pitch and something deeper, guttural. "They invited me in. A fair exchange, don't you think? Her life for my freedom?" Sarah backed toward the doorway, clutching the salt container to her chest. "They didn't know what they were doing. They knew enough," it hissed. "Enough to trap me when they realized their mistake. Your blood has kept me bound for generations." The thing's form flickered, momentarily revealing something dark and shapeless beneath the guise of the little girl. "But the line ends with you, doesn't it, Sarah? No children to continue the binding after you're gone." With a sudden movement, Sarah flung a handful of salt toward the figure. It shrieked, the sound piercing and inhuman, as its form dissipated into shadow. Sarah didn't wait to see more. She ran back toward the stairs, taking them two at a time. As she reached the top, a force slammed into her from behind, sending her sprawling onto the landing. The salt container flew from her grasp, spilling across the floor. Sarah scrambled to recover what she could, scooping handfuls back into the container. A cold, unnatural wind whipped through the hallway as she made her way back to Alice's room. The door stood open, and inside she found Mark on the floor, a gash across his forehead, blood trickling down his temple. "Mark!" She rushed to his side, helping him sit up. "What happened?" "It came through the door," he mumbled, pressing his hand to his wound. "Like it went right through the wood, threw me against the wall." Sarah quickly explained what had happened downstairs. "We need to do this now, before it comes back." With shaking hands, she placed the cloth doll in the center of the room and encircled it with salt. Mark steadied himself against the bed frame, watching as Sarah retrieved the paper with Elizabeth's instructions. "What was called remains bound," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "What was invited is refused. By blood and salt, we renew the seal." The temperature in the room plummeted, frost crystallizing on the windows. The electric charge in the air made their hair stand on end. "What was called remains bound," she repeated. "What was invited is refused. By blood and salt we renew the seal." A howling wind tore through the room, scattering books from shelves and sending the antique dolls crashing to the floor. The salt circle around the cloth doll remained undisturbed, as if protected by an invisible barrier. For the third time, Sarah spoke the words, "What was called remains bound. What was invited is refused. By blood and salt we renew the seal." As she finished, the bedroom door slammed shut with such force that the frame cracked. The small figure materialized in the corner of the room, its appearance rapidly shifting between the innocent form of Alice and something darker, more primal, a writhing shadow with too many limbs, eyes gleaming from impossible places. "You are not of the direct line," it snarled, the voice no longer attempting to mimic a child's. "The binding will not hold." "Yes, I am," Sarah replied with sudden certainty. "Elizabeth was my grandmother. I am blood of her blood." With deliberate movements, Sarah used her fingernail to prick her index finger. Blood welled from the small wound, bright red in the dim light. She held her hand over the cloth doll, allowing 3 drops to fall onto the crude fabric. The effect was immediate and violent. The entity shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadow form contorted, thrashing against invisible constraints as it was drawn inexorably toward the cloth doll in the salt circle. "No!" it howled, its voice distorting into something beyond human comprehension. "Not again! I will not be bound!" But the pull was too strong. Like smoke being sucked into a vacuum, the entity collapsed inward, funneling into the small cloth doll until nothing remained but the eerie silence of the room. The doll sat innocuously in its circle of salt, appearing no different than before, except for the 3 small bloodstains now absorbed into its fabric. Sarah exhaled shakily, looking at Mark. "We need to seal it back in the wall before dawn." Dawn was still hours away when Sarah and Mark made their way to the cellar, the cloth doll wrapped in a handkerchief and clutched tightly in Sarah's hand. The binding ritual had drained them both, leaving them exhausted but determined to complete the final step before sunrise. The cellar was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house having dissipated after the entity was once again contained within its vessel. Mark held the flashlight, illuminating their path as Sarah approached the section of wall where she had found the doll the previous day. "It feels almost too easy," she murmured, kneeling before the loose stone she had removed. "After everything that happened, just putting it back seems anticlimactic." "I'm okay with anticlimactic," Mark replied, the bandage on his forehead a stark reminder of the night's dangers. "The instructions were clear. Return the vessel to the wall. Let's not complicate things." Sarah nodded, carefully placing the wrapped doll into the cavity behind the loose stone. As she did so, her fingers brushed against something else hidden in the darkness of the small space, something that hadn't been visible when she'd removed the doll. Curious, she pulled it out, a small tin box, its surface corroded with age. Prying open the rusted lid, she found a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings inside, along with a daguerreotype photograph so old the image had almost faded away. The topmost clipping was dated October 1899, with the headline, "Charleston Medium Arrested for Fraud and Endangerment of Child." Sarah scanned the brittle newspaper, her flashlight illuminating the faded text. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, who claims the ability to communicate with spirits and cure ailments through supernatural means, was arrested yesterday following the death of 8-year-old Martha Collins. The child, who suffered from pneumonia, was allegedly subjected to treatments by Blackwood that witnesses described as horrific rituals. The child's father, James Collins, claims Blackwood promised to cure his daughter, but instead performed ceremonies that caused the girl great distress before her death. Authorities are investigating similar allegations from other families." Sarah set the clipping aside with trembling fingers and examined the next one, dated 6 months later. "Blackwood escapes custody, whereabouts unknown." "Mark," she whispered, "I think this is her, the woman who performed the ritual on Alice. She had done it before in Charleston, and it went wrong there too." The daguerreotype showed a severe-looking woman in her 40s, with sharp features and penetrating eyes. Written on the back, in faded ink, Eleanor Blackwood, 1895. Mark crouched beside her, examining the remaining clippings. Most were short notices from different New England newspapers about mysterious illnesses, miraculous recoveries, and in 2 cases, unexplained deaths, followed by a stranger's hasty departure from town. She was moving up the coast, he observed, leaving disasters in her wake. The final clipping, from a Portsmouth newspaper dated December 1901, was brief. Unidentified female body found in harbour. The article mentioned severe trauma to the body, suggesting foul play, but no identification had been made. They killed her, Sarah realized. After what happened with Alice, my great-grandparents or someone else in town, they killed her and dumped her body. Mark's expression was grim. And buried the secret along with her. Except the thing she brought back with Alice, they couldn't get rid of that so easily. Sarah carefully returned the tin box and its contents to the wall cavity, placing it beside the wrapped doll. She then fitted the stone back into place, pressing it firmly until it sat flush with the surrounding wall. The binding will hold until the next October 20th, she said, brushing dust from her hands as she stood. After that, someone will need to perform the ritual again. That's a year away, Mark pointed out. We have time to decide what to do. As they climbed the stairs back to the kitchen, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the windows. The house felt different now, still old and filled with memories, but no longer threatening. The doors that had been jammed now opened easily, and the unnatural cold had dissipated. While Mark made coffee, Sarah returned to the study, drawn once again to the family photograph album. She opened it to the 1901 portrait, half expecting Alice's image to have disappeared entirely. Instead, to her surprise, the girl's face was clear again, no longer blurred, but her expression seemed different somehow, more at peace. Sarah traced the outline of the forgotten child's face with her fingertip. "I promise you won't be erased again," she whispered to the photograph. "Whatever happened to you wasn't your fault." Later that morning, as they packed to return to their hotel in town, planning to come back and continue sorting through Elizabeth's belongings the next day, Sarah made a detour to Alice's preserved bedroom. The room had been restored to order after the chaos of the binding ritual, almost as if unseen hands had carefully replaced every fallen doll and book. On impulse, Sarah took the framed photograph of Alice from the vanity table and placed it in her bag. This small piece of family history, this child who had been systematically removed from memory, deserved to be acknowledged, not hidden away. As they drove away from the old Victorian house, Sarah looked back at its weathered facade, seeing it not just as her grandmother's home, but as the keeper of family secrets spanning generations. "What will you do with the house?" Mark asked, as they turned onto the main road. "Still planning to sell it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't think I can," she finally answered, "not knowing what's bound inside its walls. Not knowing that someone needs to be there next October to renew the ritual." "We could look for another solution," Mark suggested. "There must be people who know about these things, ways to break the cycle permanently." Sarah nodded slowly. "We'll research it. But until we find an answer, the house stays in the family. I won't pass this burden to strangers." As they drove toward town, neither noticed the small figure watching from an upstairs window of the old house. A girl in a white dress, her face solemn, her dark eyes following the departing car until it disappeared from sight. November brought early snow to Portsmouth, transforming the Mills house into a postcard-perfect scene with white frosted gables and icicles hanging from the eaves. Sarah had extended their stay indefinitely, taking a leave of absence from her job in Boston to focus on researching the entity bound within the house's walls. They had converted the study into a research center of sorts, with books on occult history, New England folklore, and supernatural phenomena stacked in precarious towers around the room. Sarah's laptop was surrounded by notebooks filled with her increasingly cramped handwriting, timelines, theories, and potential leads. "Listen to this," she said one evening, looking up from an obscure text on colonial-era supernatural beliefs. "There are accounts from the 1600s about hollow children, cases where children who were gravely ill suddenly recovered, only to begin exhibiting disturbing behavior. Family members claimed they weren't the same person, that something else was looking out through their eyes." Mark glanced up from his own reading. Over the weeks, his initial skepticism had given way to grudging acceptance of their strange circumstances. "Any mention of how they dealt with these cases?" Sarah grimaced. "Usually with hanging or drowning, unfortunately. Early colonists tended to attribute anything unusual to witchcraft or demonic possession. They had reached out cautiously to experts in various fields. Folklorists, paranormal researchers, even a reluctant academic specializing in the history of spiritualism. Most dismissed their inquiries as research for a book, offering general information but little practical help. The few who seemed to have genuine knowledge were hesitant to get involved, especially when Sarah mentioned the binding ritual. "We're missing something," Mark said, setting aside a dusty volume on New England hauntings. "The binding works, but it's a temporary solution. There must be a way to break the cycle permanently." Sarah rubbed her tired eyes. "My family has been maintaining this binding for over a century. If there was an easier solution, wouldn't they have found it?" "Not necessarily. Your great-grandfather was consumed by guilt. Maybe continuing the binding was a form of penance for him. And your grandmother, she maintained Alice's room all those years. That wasn't just about containing the entity. It was about preserving the memory of a child everyone else had erased." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door, unusual given the house's isolated location and the snowy weather. They exchanged puzzled glances before Mark went to answer it. He returned moments later accompanied by an elderly woman bundled in a heavy coat, her white hair tucked beneath a wool hat. "This is Abigail Pierce," he explained. "She says she knew your grandmother." The woman smiled thinly, removing her gloves. "Not just knew her. Elizabeth Mills and I were friends for over 60 years. When I heard her granddaughter had moved into the old house, I thought it was time we met." Her sharp eyes took in the books scattered around the room, lingering on an open text about binding rituals. "I see you've discovered the family responsibility." Sarah stared at the woman, speechless for a moment. "You know about Alice?" Abigail nodded, settling into an armchair by the fireplace without waiting for an invitation. "Elizabeth told me everything back in 1952, after she performed the binding ritual for the first time. She needed someone to confide in, and I'd already noticed peculiarities about this house." "Did she ever look for a permanent solution?" Mark asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Of course she did. We both did, for decades." The old woman's expression grew distant. "We consulted people far more knowledgeable than ourselves. A Haitian mambo in the 60s, a rabbi from New York who specialized in Dybbuk cases, even a Catholic priest trained in the old rites. None could offer a permanent solution without great risk." "What kind of risk?" Sarah pressed. Abigail fixed her with a steady gaze. "Attempting to destroy such an entity, rather than contain it, can have catastrophic consequences. The binding is imperfect, but it works. Breaking it without a foolproof alternative would be like opening Pandora's box." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "Elizabeth wanted you to have this when the time came. It contains everything she learned over the years, her research, contacts, attempts that failed. She knew eventually the responsibility would fall to you." Sarah accepted the journal with reverence, feeling the weight of its significance beyond its physical heft. "How did you know I'd found out about Alice?" A faint smile crossed Abigail's lined face. "The binding was renewed on October 20th. I felt it. Anyone sensitive to such things within a mile of this house would have felt it. Elizabeth said you had the gift, though you might not know it yet. The Mills women always have. D. After Abigail left, promising to return with more information from her own research, Sarah sat by the fire, reading her grandmother's journal. The elegant handwriting filled page after page with observations, theories, and accounts of increasingly desperate attempts to find a permanent solution to their family curse. One entry from 1973 caught her attention. Consulted Dr. Kaplan at Miskatonic University today regarding the nature of the entity. His theory is troubling. He believes what we're dealing with is not a spirit or demon in the traditional sense, but something he calls a psychic parasite. These entities exist in a liminal space between our reality and another, unable to fully manifest in our world without a host. The ritual Blackwood performed created a gateway using Alice's life force, allowing this thing partial entry. It cannot be destroyed because it does not fully exist here, but neither can it return to its own realm while the binding holds it to the doll. Sarah looked up at Mark, who had been reading over her shoulder. A psychic parasite trapped between worlds, she murmured. That's why the binding needs to be renewed. It's not just containing it, it's actively preventing it from either fully entering our world or returning to its own. So theoretically, Mark said slowly, if we could force it completely into our world, it could be destroyed. Or if we could push it back to wherever it came from. Either would be incredibly dangerous, Sarah pointed out. If we tried to force it out of our reality and failed, it might escape the binding entirely, and if we tried to fully manifest it here, we'd be giving it exactly what it wants, complete access to our world. She continued reading, finding an entry from 1981 that made her blood run cold. Abigail and I attempted a banishing ritual based on Solomon's teachings tonight. Something went terribly wrong. The entity partially broke free, manifesting more strongly than ever before. Took the form of Alice, but twisted wrong. It spoke through her voice, saying it had waited decades for freedom and would wait decades more if necessary. Said our bloodline would eventually thin, our vigilance would waver, and then it would claim what was promised to it. We barely managed to reinforce the binding. James Miller from next door died of a heart attack the same night. Coincidence, or evidence of the entity's growing influence, cannot risk another attempt. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. They tried to banish it in 1981. It almost got free. Mark's expression was grim. And someone died. Your grandmother stopped looking for alternatives after that, didn't she? Sarah nodded, flipping through the remaining pages. The later entries focused solely on maintaining the binding and preserving Alice's memory, with no further mention of permanent solutions. That night, Sarah dreamed of Alice. Not the twisted version the entity had manifested as, but the real child who had died over a century ago. In the dream, Alice sat on her small bed, brushing her dark hair with the silver-handled brush that still sat on the vanity table. It wasn't your fault, Sarah told the child in her dream. What happened to you wasn't your fault. Alice turned to look at her with sad eyes. It wasn't Father's fault either. He just wanted to save me. But he invited something dangerous into you. The child nodded solemnly. It was already there, though. The woman just gave it a way in. What do you mean, already there? Sarah asked, but the dream began to fade, Alice's form growing transparent. Look beneath, the child whispered as she disappeared. The answer is beneath. Sarah awoke with a start, the words echoing in her mind. Look beneath. Beside her, Mark stirred. What's wrong? I had a dream about Alice. She said to look beneath, that the answer is beneath something. Mark sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Beneath the house? The cellar? We've already searched the cellar thoroughly. Sarah's mind raced, trying to interpret the cryptic message. Beneath what? The answer came to her suddenly. Beneath the story we've been told. What if there's more to what happened than what's in the family records? What if the entity wasn't just randomly called by Blackwood's ritual? What if, like Alice said in my dream, it was already there? December arrived with bitter cold and shortened days. Sarah had been systematically working through Elizabeth's journal, following leads and contacting the few surviving individuals mentioned in its pages. Most were deceased, their knowledge lost, but a few provided small pieces to the expanding puzzle. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through town records at the Portsmouth Historical Society, Sarah discovered that the land where the Mills house stood had a history predating her family's ownership. Before William Mills purchased the property in 1889, it had belonged to a shipping merchant named Caleb Whitaker, who had built the original structure in 1823. Further research revealed disturbing details about Whitaker. Several crew members from his ships had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Local newspapers from the time contained veiled references to unseemly practices and foreign influences in the Whitaker household. Most telling was a small article from 1845 reporting that Whitaker's youngest daughter had become afflicted with a mysterious ailment after her father returned from a trading voyage to the Caribbean. "This changes everything," Sarah told Mark as they drove back to the house that evening, snow falling in thick flakes around them. What if Whitaker brought something back with him, some entity or force that remained tied to the property? What if it was already there when my family moved in, dormant until Blackwood's ritual gave it access to Alice? That would explain why the binding isn't permanent, Mark reasoned. You're not addressing the source of the problem, just containing a symptom. Back at the house, they searched with renewed purpose, looking for any evidence of the property's original owner. In a corner of the attic, beneath layers of old carpeting, they discovered a trap door previously hidden from view. It opened to reveal a small space containing a sea chest, Whitaker's name burnt into the wood. Inside the chest were navigational instruments, ship's logs, and a journal bound in strange mottled leather. The journal documented Whitaker's trading voyages, including a fateful trip to Haiti in 1844. Several pages detailed his meeting with a practitioner of what he called the old ways, who sold him a carved obsidian figurine said to bring prosperity and ward off misfortune. Whitaker's later entries grew increasingly erratic, describing voices whispering from the figurine, his daughter's declining health, and his own growing obsession with the artifact's power. The final entry, dated January 1846, read simply, "It demands more than I can give. May God forgive what I have brought upon this house." "The figurine," Sarah said, her voice tight with apprehension. "That has to be the original vessel. Whitaker brought the entity here, and it's been bound to this property ever since." "But where is it now?" Mark wondered, searching through the chest's remaining contents. "There's nothing else here." Sarah thought back to Alice's words in her dream. "Look beneath." "The cellar?" she said suddenly. "Not in the walls, but beneath the floor." The original house would have had a dirt floor cellar. When renovations were done, they might have poured concrete over it. Armed with flashlights and a sledgehammer borrowed from the garden shed, they descended to the cellar. The concrete floor was cracked in several places, particularly in the far corner where the foundation showed signs of settling. Mark attacked the largest crack with the sledgehammer, breaking through the thin concrete to the dirt beneath. They took turns digging, the work slow and difficult in the confined space. 3 feet down, Sarah's shovel struck something solid. Carefully clearing away the surrounding dirt, they uncovered a small iron box sealed with wax and inscribed with symbols neither recognized. The box was bound with copper wire that had turned green with age. "Should we open it?" Mark asked, his voice hushed in the oppressive silence of the cellar. Sarah hesitated, remembering her grandmother's warning about attempting to deal with the entity directly. "Not here," she decided, "and not without preparation." They brought the box upstairs, placing it in the center of a salt circle in the study. Sarah called Abigail Pierce, who arrived within the hour, despite the late time and worsening weather. The elderly woman paled at the sight of the iron box. "You found the origin point," she whispered, keeping her distance from the salt circle. Elizabeth suspected there was something before the doll, but we never found it. It belonged to Caleb Whitaker, Sarah explained, showing her the sea captain's journal. He brought it back from Haiti in 1844. Abigail studied the symbols on the box. These are binding sigils, older and more powerful than the ritual your family has been using. This isn't just containing the entity, it's imprisoning it at its entry point to our world. But it got out, Mark pointed out. It possessed Alice. Not exactly, Abigail corrected him. These old bindings work differently. The entity itself remained trapped, but its influence could reach out, especially to the vulnerable, like a dying child. The ritual Blackwood performed was probably intended to draw on the entity's power to heal Alice, but instead it created a secondary vessel, Alice herself. When your great-grandfather realized what had happened, the second binding was created with the doll. Sarah frowned, processing this new information. So we've been maintaining the secondary binding all these years, while the primary binding has been weakening beneath the house? Abigail nodded gravely. And each time the secondary binding is renewed, it likely draws power from the primary one, weakening it further. It's only a matter of time before both fail completely. How do we fix this? Mark asked. Can we strengthen both bindings? The old woman shook her head. The solution isn't to continue binding it. As long as the entity has any foothold in our world, any vessel to inhabit, even partially, it will continue to grow stronger, more determined. The only permanent solution is to sever its connection completely. How? Sarah pressed. Every attempt my grandmother made was too dangerous, because she was trying to banish something that was already bound to two vessels. You need to combine them first, reunite the fragmented entity, then send it back through the gateway it originally used to enter our world. Mark looked skeptical. You're saying we need to put the entity from the doll back into this box, then close the gateway for good? It won't be easy, Abigail warned. The entity will resist with everything it has, but with the right ritual, performed at the right time by someone of the Mills bloodline, it could work. She reached into her bag and withdrew an ancient leather-bound book. This text contains a ritual of severance, a way to close a gateway between worlds permanently. Elizabeth and I found it years ago, but deemed it too risky without the original vessel. Now that you've found it, her voice trailed off as she handed the book to Sarah. When should we do this? Sarah asked, leafing through the yellowed pages covered in handwritten Latin text and arcane diagrams. The winter solstice, Abigail replied without hesitation. December 21st, when the night is longest and the veil between worlds at its thinnest. It's your best chance to push the entity back through to its own realm and seal the gateway behind it. As they discussed the preparations needed for the ritual, none of them noticed the subtle drop in temperature in the room, nor the way the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and shift, as if listening. The winter solstice arrived with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate, a snowstorm that isolated the Mills house from the rest of Portsmouth, wind howling around the eaves like a living thing. Sarah and Mark had spent the preceding weeks in careful preparation, following Abigail's guidance and the instructions in the ancient text. The ritual would take place in the cellar, where they had expanded the hole in the concrete floor to expose a larger section of the original dirt foundation. They had marked a complex pattern of symbols in chalk on the floor surrounding the hole, symbols of binding, severance, and protection drawn from traditions spanning continents and centuries. At the center of the pattern, they placed both vessels, the iron box containing the obsidian figurine and the cloth doll from the wall. Around the perimeter, they positioned white candles at specific intervals, along with small bowls containing various ritual elements, salt, iron filings, dried herbs, and water collected from 7 different sources. Everything's ready, Sarah told Abigail, who had arrived hours earlier to help with the final preparations. We should begin soon. The solstice peaks at 11:47 tonight. The elderly woman nodded, her face grave as she reviewed the ritual components one final time. "Remember, once we begin, we must not stop until it's complete. The entity will fight back. It will try to distract you, frighten you, turn you against each other. You must resist." "What exactly will happen?" Mark asked, arranging the last of the candles. Despite his initial skepticism months ago, he had become fully committed to the task, his academic background proving useful in deciphering the ancient texts. "If all goes as planned," Abigail explained, "the ritual will first draw the fragmented entity from the doll back to its original vessel in the box. Then we'll open a temporary gateway to push both back to wherever it came from, sealing the passage behind it." "And if it doesn't go as planned?" Sarah asked quietly. Abigail's expression was somber. "Then God help us all." As the hour approached, they took their positions around the ritual space. Sarah, as the Mills descendant, would lead the ritual, reading the Latin incantations while performing the necessary actions. Mark would maintain the integrity of the protective circle, reinforcing it with salt and iron as needed. Abigail would monitor for signs of the entity's resistance and guide Sarah through the complex series of steps. At exactly 11:30 p.m. they began. Sarah lit the candles one by one, moving clockwise around the circle while reciting the opening invocation. The flames burned unnaturally bright in the dim cellar, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. When all 13 candles were lit, Sarah returned to her position at the head of the circle and opened the ancient text to the first page of the ritual. Her voice was steady as she began to read the Latin words, the unfamiliar language flowing more easily than she had expected, as if something within her recognized the power they contained. "Quod divisum est, nunc conjungatur," she intoned. "Quod eravit, revocetur. Quod alienum est, expellatur." As she spoke, the temperature in the cellar plummeted. Their breath became visible in the frigid air, but the candle flames remained steady, unaffected by the cold. Sarah continued with the ritual, sprinkling a mixture of herbs and salts over both vessels while reciting the next section of the text. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, creating a resonance that could be felt rather than heard. The first sign that something was happening came when the cloth doll began to tremble, almost imperceptibly at first. Then, with increasing violence, a low humming sound emanated from it, rising in pitch until it became a high-pitched keening that set their teeth on edge. "It's resisting," Abigail warned. "Keep going, Sarah. Don't stop." Sarah raised her voice over the noise, continuing with the ritual words. Mark moved around the outer edge of the circle, reinforcing it with additional salt, where the lines had been disturbed by the vibrations now running through the cellar floor. Suddenly, the keening stopped. An unnatural silence fell over the room, broken only by Sarah's continued recitation. Then, without warning, the cloth doll burst into flames, brilliant blue fire that consumed the fabric without leaving ash. "It's working," Abigail breathed, watching intently. "The fragment is being drawn back to the original vessel." As the doll burned away completely, the iron box began to shudder violently, the symbols etched on its surface glowing with an eerie light. Sarah reached for the small silver knife they had prepared, making a shallow cut across her palm. According to the ritual, Mill's blood was required to open the box and expose the figurine within. "Sanguine meo, portam aperio," she said, allowing 3 drops of blood to fall onto the box. "Sanguine meo, te revoco." The wax seal around the box's lid began to melt, and the copper wires uncoiled of their own accord. The lid slowly raised, revealing the obsidian figurine inside, a small, crude carving of a human-like form with too many limbs and no discernible face. The moment the figurine was exposed, the candles flared to impossible heights, their flames nearly reaching the low ceiling. The air in the cellar became thick, charged with an energy that made their skin crawl, and then they heard it. Voices, dozens of them, whispering in languages none of them understood, growing louder with each passing second. "Now, Sarah," Abigail urged, "begin the banishing." Sarah turned to the final pages of the ritual, her hands shaking as she struggled to focus on the words through the cacophony of whispers. "Porta claudatur," she began, "iter intercludatur, per ignem et caelum et ferrum te in exilium mitto." A violent gust of wind tore through the cellar, extinguishing all the candles at once and plunging them into darkness. Before Mark could react with the matches, an invisible force slammed into him, throwing him against the far wall with a sickening thud. "Mark!" Sarah cried out, momentarily breaking her concentration. "Don't stop!" Abigail commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Whatever happens, don't stop the ritual." In the darkness, Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, clicking it on to illuminate the text. The beam wavered, growing dimmer even as she watched, but provided just enough light to continue reading. "Per ignem et caelum et ferrum te in exilium mitto," she repeated, her voice stronger now, fueled by determination. "Numquam rediturus, numquam revocandus." A child's laughter echoed through the cellar. Alice's laughter, but wrong, distorted. In the feeble light of the failing flashlight, Sarah saw a shape forming above the open box, a swirling darkness taking on a vaguely human form. "You cannot send me back," it said, its voice a discordant blend of child and adult, male and female, ancient and new. "I have been here too long. This place is mine now." "Ignore it," Abigail hissed, moving to check on Mark, who was slumped against the wall, semi-conscious. "It's trying to distract you." Sarah forced herself to continue, even as the shape grew more defined, more threatening. "Sigillum aeternum superportum pono, clausum sit, finitum sit." The entity shrieked, the sound piercing enough to shatter the glass of the flashlight bulb. In the sudden return to darkness, Sarah felt, rather than saw, the entity surge toward her, a cold malevolence reaching out with invisible tendrils. Acting on instinct, Sarah grabbed the container of salt and flung it at the approaching darkness. There was a hiss like water on hot metal, and the entity recoiled. Using the momentary reprieve, Sarah recited the final words of the ritual from memory, her voice rising above the entity's continued shrieking. "Per virtutem sanguinis mei, per potestatem terrae et caeli, porta claudatur in aeternum." A blinding flash of light burst from the iron box, illuminating the cellar in stark white brilliance. Sarah caught a glimpse of the entity being pulled back toward the box, its amorphous form stretching and distorting as if being sucked through an invisible drain. The shrieking rose to an unbearable pitch, and then silence. The light faded, leaving them in darkness once more. For several seconds, none of them moved or spoke, afraid that any sound might somehow reverse what had just occurred. Finally, Mark's flashlight clicked on, its beam sweeping across the ritual space. The chalk symbols were gone, erased as if they had never been drawn. The candles had melted into unrecognizable lumps of wax. The iron box lay open, but the obsidian figurine inside had crumbled to dust. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the ritual's demands. Abigail moved slowly to the center of the circle, her aged hands hovering over the box without touching it. "Yes," she said after a long moment, "I can't feel its presence anymore. The gateway is closed." Mark limped to Sarah's side, a bruise forming on his temple from his impact with the wall. "How can we be sure?" "We can't, not completely," Abigail admitted, "but the signs are promising. The figurine has turned to dust, its purpose fulfilled, and the air feels cleaner somehow." Sarah realized she was right. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house since their arrival, the sense of being watched, of something malevolent lurking just out of sight, was gone. She could breathe freely for the first time in months. As if to confirm their success, the electricity in the house suddenly returned, lights flickering on throughout the cellar. Outside, the howling wind died down to a gentle whisper, the storm passing as abruptly as it had arrived. "It's really over," Sarah whispered, allowing herself to believe it. "After more than a century, it's finally over." Spring came early to Portsmouth that year, as if nature itself was celebrating the Mills house's liberation. The ancient maples lining the property budded weeks ahead of schedule, and crocuses pushed through the thawing soil in vibrant clusters. Sarah stood on the front porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the old house in warm golden light. 3 months had passed since the winter solstice ritual, and the change in the property was palpable, not just the absence of the malevolent presence that had haunted it for generations, but a newfound lightness, as if the house itself could breathe again. "Morning," Mark called, joining her on the porch. The bruise from his encounter with the cellar wall had long since faded, but the experience had left other, less visible marks on both of them. They had witnessed something beyond ordinary understanding, something that had changed their perception of reality in subtle but fundamental ways. "Abigail called," Sarah told him, sipping her coffee. "She's coming by this afternoon to see the changes we've made." The renovations had been extensive but respectful of the house's history. They had removed the concrete floor in the cellar entirely, replacing it with proper drainage, and a new floor that allowed the old foundation to breathe. Upstairs, they had preserved most of the original features while updating the plumbing and electrical systems. Most significantly, they had transformed Alice's room. No longer a shrine frozen in time, it was now a bright, welcoming space that honored her memory, without perpetuating the family's century of silence. Sarah had framed the 1901 family portrait and hung it prominently in the entrance hall. Alice's solemn face, no longer hidden or blurred, but acknowledged as an integral part of the Mills family history. "Have you decided what you're going to do with the house long-term?" Mark asked, leaning against the porch railing. Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm keeping it, not just because of its history, but because it feels like home now. I've spent my whole adult life in apartments in Boston, never putting down roots. This place has roots enough for generations." She didn't mention the other reason, the dreams she'd been having since the ritual. Not nightmares of Alice or the entity, but peaceful visions of the house filled with life again, of children running through its rooms without fear, of family gatherings in the renovated parlor, dreams that felt more like possibilities than mere wishes. Later that afternoon, Abigail arrived, moving more slowly than before, but with the same sharp eyes that missed nothing. She walked through the house with Sarah and Mark, nodding approvingly at the changes. "You've done good work here," she said as they settled in the parlor for tea. "Not just the exorcism, but this, reclaiming the house for the living." "I couldn't have done it without your help," Sarah replied, "without the knowledge you and my grandmother preserved." Abigail smiled faintly. "Elizabeth would be proud. She always hoped the house would find peace someday." She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a small wooden box. "She wanted you to have this, but only when the time was right. I think that time has come." Sarah accepted the box, its wood smooth from decades of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. When opened, it revealed a tiny portrait of Alice, not the solemn girl from the family photograph, but a different image, showing her laughing, eyes bright with life. "This was the real Alice," Abigail explained softly. "Before the illness. Elizabeth found it among her mother Ruth's possessions after she died. She kept it close all her life, but wanted it returned to the family line when the time was right." Sarah felt tears welling as she studied the tiny portrait, this glimpse of Alice as she truly had been, not the solemn, sickly child of the formal photograph, nor the malevolent entity that had worn her form. Just a little girl with a bright smile, whose life had been cut tragically short. "Thank you," she whispered, closing the locket carefully and slipping the chain around her neck. Abigail nodded, satisfied. "There's something else you should know," she said, her tone more serious. "The ritual we performed didn't just close a doorway. It healed a wound in this place, a tear in the fabric between worlds that had been leaking darkness for over a century." "What does that mean for the house?" Mark asked. "It means this property has been recalibrated, for lack of a better word. Places that have known great darkness often become vessels for light once they're cleansed. She smiled at Sarah's puzzled expression. You'll understand in time. Just know that what your family maintained through obligation and fear, you can now nurture through choice and love. After Abigail left, Sarah and Mark continued working on the house until sunset, installing new light fixtures in the upstairs hallway. As darkness fell, they stood in Alice's former room, now a comfortable guest bedroom, looking out at the stars beginning to appear in the clear spring sky. Do you ever wonder about her? Mark asked quietly. The real Alice, I mean. Not just what happened to her, but who she might have become. Sarah touched the locket at her throat. All the time. She was only 7 when she died. She never had a chance to grow up, to have a life of her own. Maybe that's why your family couldn't let her go, not just because of the entity, but because her story felt so unfinished. Sarah nodded, a realization forming as she spoke. And maybe that's what we're meant to do now. Not just remember her, but live the lives she couldn't. Make this house a home again. The next morning, Sarah woke early, drawn downstairs by the soft sound of humming coming from the kitchen. She followed the sound, expecting to find Mark making breakfast, but the kitchen was empty, the humming fading as she entered. On the kitchen table sat her grandmother's photo album, open to a page she hadn't noticed before. Among photographs from the 1950s was a small newspaper clipping announcing the birth of Elizabeth's daughter, Sarah's mother, in 1952. Beneath it, in Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, "Life continues. The darkness does not win." Sarah smiled, running her fingers over the words. Outside, the first birds of spring were singing, their chorus filling the air with promise. The Mills house stood solid around her, no longer a repository of secrets and fear, but a foundation for whatever came next. In the months that followed, Sarah and Mark made the decision to stay in Portsmouth permanently. Mark transferred to a local university where he could continue his research, while Sarah established a small archival consulting business, helping families and historical societies preserve their records and photographs. They were married in the garden behind the Mills house on a perfect October day, with Abigail Pierce as their honored guest. The old woman watched with knowing eyes as they exchanged vows beneath the ancient maple trees, their leaves a blaze of crimson and gold. That night, after the last guests had departed, Sarah stood in the entrance hall, looking at the 1901 family portrait, at Alice's small, solemn face among her family members. "We remember you," she whispered to the image. "You're not erased anymore." As if in answer, a warm breeze drifted through the hall, carrying the faint scent of summer flowers, though autumn was well underway. Sarah smiled, understanding what Abigail had meant about the house being recalibrated. The darkness had been banished, but something else had taken its place, something that felt remarkably like grace. A year later, on a snowy December evening, Sarah sat in what had once been her grandmother's study, now converted to a nursery. She rocked gently in the antique chair that had been in the family for generations, singing softly to the infant girl in her arms. Mark paused in the doorway, watching them with quiet joy. "She's finally asleep?" Sarah nodded, continuing to rock. "Just now." She fought it as long as she could, watching the snow fall outside the window. "Curious about everything, even at 3 months old," Mark said proudly, crossing the room to place a gentle kiss on his daughter's forehead. They had named her Alice Elizabeth Mills, reclaiming both names from the shadows of the past. Unlike her namesake, this Alice would grow up in a house filled with light and love, the legacy of darkness transformed into something new. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby stirred in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling around the silver locket Sarah still wore, the locket containing the portrait of the first Alice, smiling and full of life. Sarah touched her daughter's hand, feeling the connection between past and present, between what was lost and what had been found. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the Mills property in pristine white. The old Victorian house stood sentinel against the winter night, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled out across the snow. From the highest gable to the deepest foundation, the house had been renewed, its long burden lifted, its purpose reclaimed. Sarah knew there would always be a certain sensitivity to the property, a thinness in the veil between worlds that could never be completely erased. But what had once been a gateway for darkness now seemed to channel something else, a watchfulness, a protection, as if the house itself had become guardian to those who dwelled within its walls. That night, as she and Mark slept peacefully in what had once been her grandmother's bedroom, Sarah dreamed of the house through the seasons and years to come, of her daughter's first steps across the parlor floor, of birthdays and holidays celebrated in rooms once shrouded in secrets, of the garden blooming more abundantly each spring. And in the dream, she saw a small figure watching from the edge of the property, a girl in a white dress, her dark hair caught in the breeze. But unlike the malevolent apparition that had haunted the house for generations, this presence was serene, almost luminous. The girl smiled at Sarah, a smile of recognition and release, before turning away and fading into the landscape like morning mist in sunshine. Sarah woke with the certainty that she had glimpsed the true Alice, not as she had been in life, or as the entity had portrayed her, but as she existed now, finally, at peace. The Mills family's long vigil was over. The binding ritual would never need to be performed again. In the nursery across the hall, the baby Alice cooed softly in her sleep, her dreams untroubled by the shadows that had once dwelled in the walls around her. And throughout the old house, from the newly renovated attic to the reclaimed cellar, a profound stillness settled, not the heavy silence of secrets kept, but the quiet contentment of a place that had finally found its purpose. The legacy of the Mills family had been transformed. What had begun in fear and obligation would continue in hope and love, passed down not as a burden but as a gift, the gift of a home where darkness had been overcome, where remembrance brought healing rather than pain, and where the future could unfold unhampered by the chains of the past. Sarah Mills hadn't known what she would find when she first returned to her grandmother's house in Portsmouth. She certainly hadn't expected to uncover a century-old family secret, to confront an entity from beyond our world, or to find her own place in a lineage of women who had safeguarded their family through generations. But as she drifted back to sleep, the silver locket warm against her skin and her husband's arm around her waist, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In a house that had weathered storms both natural and supernatural, that had known both profound darkness and transcendent light, and that now stood ready to shelter a new generation of the Mills family as they wrote their own story within its walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the old house stood strong against the winter night, its burdens lifted, its peace restored, its future bright with possibility.